The parents of an 18-year-old boy are brutally murdered in their home.
I think it was certainly the most shocking murder I dealt with.
Just the manner in which he murdered them with the knife and a hammer.
Brian Blackwell. On the evening of November 29, 2004, in the affluent suburb of Sutton Coldfield, West Midlands, England, 20-year-old Brian Blackwell brutally ended the lives of his parents, Sydney and Jacqueline Blackwell, in their own home. Sydney, aged 55, was a successful insurance executive, known for his meticulous nature and dedication to family. Jacqueline, 50, was a devoted mother and homemaker, deeply involved in her children's lives and community activities. Together, they provided comfort and stability, supporting Brian, who had recently graduated from university with aspirations of following in his father's professional footsteps. Brian's upbringing was marked by privilege, but also by intense parental control. He had lived at home well into early adulthood, enrolled at university but with limited independent experience, sheltered from financial responsibilities. Friends described him as charming and persuasive, capable of presenting a polished exterior. However, he exhibited signs of instability in relationships and finances, often exaggerating achievements and relying on his parents' wealth. Diagnoses following his arrest described traits consistent with narcissistic personality disorder, including an inflated sense of entitlement, lack of empathy, and difficulty accepting personal responsibility. The day of the killings began without public indication of conflict, but tensions had been building. In the days preceding the incident, arguments reportedly erupted over Brian's lavish spending and use of his parents' credit cards. That evening, a confrontation escalated. Brian struck Sydney multiple times with a hammer, sufficient to cause immediate incapacitation. Jacqueline, attempting to intervene, was then attacked with the same weapon and subsequently stabbed. Both victims sustained multiple blunt and sharp force injuries, consistent with an extended struggle within the home. Following the killings, Brian engaged in deliberate actions to conceal his involvement. He removed evidence linking him to the crime, attempted to clean the bloodied scenes, and left the house under the appearance of normalcy. Within hours, he accessed his parents' credit cards, booking luxury experiences, including hotel stays and fine dining, maintaining an outward appearance of innocence while exploiting the trust and resources of the parents he had killed. His social interactions during this period, both in person and online, demonstrated a striking dissonance between the violence committed and the calm demeanor he presented. The investigation unfolded rapidly once the victims were discovered. Neighbors raised concerns when the Blackwells failed to appear for routine engagements, prompting a welfare check. Police arrived to find both parents deceased. Forensic analysis documented the weapon-related injuries, collected biological evidence, and traced credit card use following the deaths. Digital records, including phone calls and transaction histories, provided insight into Brian's post-crime movements. Witnesses, including friends who observed his unusual spending and behavior, corroborated investigators' suspicions. Brian was arrested and charged with two counts of murder. The trial commenced in 2005 with the prosecution detailing the sequence of events, forensic findings, and patterns of behavior, demonstrating premeditation and financial motivation. The defense acknowledged the killings but emphasized mental health conditions, including narcissistic personality disorder, arguing that his disorder impaired judgment and impulse control. Expert testimony described traits of manipulation, grandiosity, and lack of empathy, framing these as contributing factors rather than direct legal excuses. The jury found Brian guilty on both counts. In December 2005, he was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years before eligibility for parole. The sentencing judge noted the calculated nature of the acts, the attempt to benefit financially, and the absence of genuine remorse. Appeals submitted by the defense were subsequently rejected, and Brian remains incarcerated, with evaluations periodically assessing his psychological status and rehabilitation prospects. The case prompted reflection on the intersection of personality disorders, privilege, and violent criminal behavior. It remains frequently cited in legal and psychological literature as an example of extreme familial homicide driven by entitlement and opportunistic motives. As investigators and psychologists continued to study patterns emerging from cases like Brian Blackwell's, attention shifted to other instances where calculated familial violence intersected with personal gain, setting the stage for exploration of similar crimes that defy conventional. Christopher Porco, on January 6, 2004, Albany, New York. In the early hours of that morning, Peter Porco, aged 64, and his wife, Joan, aged 60, were attacked in their home while they slept. Peter was struck multiple times with an axe, sustaining fatal injuries, and Joan survived severe wounds to her head and neck. Christopher's parents had no warning, no opportunity to defend themselves. Peter Porco had worked for decades as a construction engineer and was known in his community for his quiet diligence. Joan, a homemaker, was devoted to her family and maintained strong ties with neighbors and friends. They had lived in a modest suburban neighborhood for years, raising Christopher and his siblings. Joan's recovery would later reveal the trauma inflicted, both physically and emotionally, by the night's events. Christopher Porco, 20 years old at the time, lived in his parents' home while attending college. He was described by acquaintances as bright and ambitious, yet distant from his parents. Neighbors noted that Christopher had grown increasingly withdrawn and displayed signs of frustration over financial dependence. He had recently been involved in personal disputes and had a history of tension with his father over money and independence. The night of January 5th had been uneventful from an outsider's perspective, but within the home, a confrontation had reached a breaking point. Investigators later determined the attack was premeditated. Evidence suggested Christopher had been aware of his parents' sleep schedules and planned the assault carefully. The escalation was sudden but deliberate as he entered the bedroom and wielded the weapon with intent to kill. Peter Porco sustained blunt force trauma to the head, resulting in immediate death. Joan Porco suffered multiple lacerations and fractures, but retained consciousness and survived. Christopher then attempted to stage the scene. He called 911 to report the attack, claiming to have found his parents injured after returning home. His account was inconsistent, raising suspicion among first responders and investigators. Forensic analysis played a critical role in unraveling the case. Investigators noted the angle and location of the wounds, the lack of forced entry, and the trajectory of the weapon, all pointing toward someone familiar with the household. Digital evidence from phone records and computer activity further contradicted Christopher's statements. His sudden attempts to create an alibi heightened police concern. The investigation advanced methodically. Forensic teams reconstructed the timeline, noting Christopher had been seen in locations inconsistent with his claims. The discovery of financial motives and strained familial relations added context. When questioned, Christopher maintained innocence, but inconsistencies in his testimony, combined with physical and circumstantial evidence, led prosecutors to charge him with second-degree murder and attempted murder. During the trial, the prosecution focused on premeditation, financial motives, and forensic evidence. The defense argued Christopher had no memory of committing the acts and suggested alternative explanations for the injuries, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described behavioral changes in Christopher leading up to the attack. The jury considered forensic reports, 911 calls, and Christopher's attempts to mislead investigators. On November 17, 2006, Christopher Porco was convicted of second-degree murder for the death of his father and attempted murder for the injuries inflicted on his mother. He was sentenced to 50 years to life in prison. Appeals followed but were ultimately unsuccessful, and Christopher remains incarcerated. Joan Porco survived the attack and spent months recovering from her injuries. She publicly reflected on the difficulty of reconciling her son's actions with memories of his childhood. The case has been cited in studies of familicide and financial motive crimes. It raised questions about warning signs in domestic settings, the influence of financial dependence on violent outcomes, and the challenges investigators face when the perpetrator is a family member. As the case closed in court, attention turned to broader patterns of familial homicide, prompting investigators and psychologists to study the dynamics of domestic aggression and premeditated violence. From one suburban home in Albany, the ripple effects of that night would influence law enforcement practices and media coverage of similar cases for years to come. This grim chapter of New York history would soon find echoes in other familial homicides, each with its own unique dynamics, yet connected by patterns of trust, betrayal, and premeditated violence. As we move now to our next case, Zachary Davis, June 3, 2012, in Memphis, Tennessee. 15-year-old Zachary Davis struck his mother, Melanie Davis, with a sledgehammer inside their family home. The blow was sudden and fatal, ending her life instantly. Following the attack, he attempted to set fire to the house while his younger brother remained inside, creating a scene of chaos and terror within the family residence. Melanie Davis was a 36-year-old mother and caregiver. She worked part-time in retail and devoted much of her life to her children, striving to maintain a stable household despite mounting personal and financial challenges. Those who knew her described her as caring, attentive, and protective, someone who prioritized her children's well-being above all else. Zachary Davis lived with his mother and younger brother in a modest suburban home. Accounts from family and neighbors painted the picture of a teenager, increasingly withdrawn and volatile. He struggled with mental health issues that had manifested in aggression and emotional instability, though he had not previously exhibited violence on this scale. Financial pressures at home, combined with familial tensions, created an environment fraught with stress. In the weeks leading up to the attack, arguments between Zachary and his mother had intensified. Witnesses recalled frequent confrontations over household rules and Zachary's behavior at school. On the day of the incident, a heated argument escalated quickly, though the exact words exchanged remain partly speculative. What is clear is that a breaking point was reached, and Zachary's aggression erupted into lethal violence. Zachary attacked his mother in the kitchen, using a sledgehammer he had obtained earlier. Forensic reports indicate multiple, forceful blows delivered to the head and upper body, resulting in immediate and fatal injuries. After striking his mother, he turned his attention to the house itself, attempting to ignite a fire while his younger brother remained in another room. Smoke and flames caused significant damage, though the brother was rescued by first responders and suffered no life-threatening injuries. Following the crime, Zachary fled the immediate scene briefly, but returned and engaged with authorities during their investigation. Investigators noted behavior that contrasted sharply with the severity of the violence. He provided information about the events and did not attempt to conceal his identity, though the motives behind the actions remained unclear at the time. The investigation quickly uncovered the extent of the crime. Forensic evidence confirmed the cause of Melanie's death as blunt force trauma, consistent with a sledgehammer. Investigators also collected physical evidence linking Zachary to the attempted arson. Witness testimony, including that of his younger brother, corroborated the timeline of events, and surveillance footage from nearby streets provided additional context for Zachary's movements before and after the attack. During the trial, prosecutors presented a detailed account of the fatal assault and the attempted endangerment of his sibling. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the attack on both Melanie and the house itself. The defense argued that Zachary's age and mental health issues mitigated his culpability, pointing to emotional instability and impulse control problems as contributing factors. On October 11, 2013, the court found Zachary Davis guilty of first-degree murder and attempted arson. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring he would remain incarcerated for the remainder of his life. The ruling reflected both the severity of the offense and the vulnerability of the surviving family members. In the aftermath, Melanie's surviving son was placed under the care of relatives and counselors, while the community struggled to process the shock of a child killing a parent. Legal experts noted the case highlighted challenges in addressing juvenile violence and the intersection of adolescent mental health and criminal accountability. Psychologists who reviewed the case emphasized the importance of early intervention for troubled youth and family support systems that might prevent such tragedies. As Zachary began serving his life sentence, questions lingered about how warning signs were missed and how similar tragedies might be prevented in other households. The case left an indelible mark on Memphis, serving as a grim reminder of the potential for violence within domestic settings, even among those too young to legally consent to adulthood. From this tragic beginning, the documentary now turns to another case. Paris Bennett. On March 10, 2007, in Houston, Texas, 13-year-old Paris Bennett took the life of his 4-year-old sister, Ella Bennett, in a calculated act of violence intended to torment his mother. The killing occurred inside the family home, a modest suburban residence where the Bennett children had lived with their mother since the divorce of their parents. Ella, a quiet and playful child, was beloved by neighbors and family alike. She had just begun preschool and enjoyed drawing and playing with dolls. Her presence in the household was a source of joy, and her death sent immediate shockwaves through the community. Paris Bennett was 13 years old at the time, living with his mother, Kim Bennett, following his father's departure. Friends and relatives described him as withdrawn and increasingly angry in the months leading up to the murder. Reports noted behavioral instability at school, frequent disciplinary issues, and a fascination with violent media. Family members recalled that Paris struggled with mental and emotional regulation, though no formal diagnosis had been made. Financial stress weighed on the household. Kim Bennett was raising her 2 children alone, working long hours. The relationship between mother and son had been strained, with conflict becoming more frequent. The trigger for the tragedy was an argument between Paris and his mother earlier that day. Witnesses reported he had become increasingly agitated when reprimanded over chores and school performance. By the afternoon, the confrontation escalated beyond verbal disputes. Paris led Ella into a separate room, away from his mother's view. What followed was a brief but deliberate act of violence, carried out to inflict psychological harm on his mother. The assault was executed swiftly, and Paris then returned to other parts of the house as if nothing had occurred, demonstrating alarming detachment from the act he had just committed. The murder method was straightforward and grim. Paris used a blunt object within reach to strike Ella, causing immediate trauma that resulted in her death. The injuries were consistent with repeated impact, concentrated to areas that ensured lethality. Medical examination confirmed the cause of death as blunt force trauma, noting that the injuries were inconsistent with accidental harm and indicated intentional action. Following the murder, Paris did not initially confess. He attempted to conceal the act by misleading authorities, claiming Ella had wandered off. His behavior included attempts to clean and reorder the room, suggesting awareness of wrongdoing. The investigation unfolded rapidly. When Ella was reported missing, police began a neighborhood search, canvassing homes and interviewing family members. Forensic evidence from the scene, including the blunt object used combined with physical traces on Paris, led detectives to question him extensively. Investigators noted inconsistencies in his statements, ultimately confronting him with evidence that contradicted his story. Digital evidence and witness reports corroborated the timeline, placing Paris in the room at the critical time. Paris Bennett was formally charged with capital murder of a child under 6. At trial, the prosecution presented forensic evidence, witness testimony, and psychological assessments, highlighting Paris's motive to torment his mother. The defense argued that his age and immaturity should mitigate culpability, citing potential developmental and mental health factors. The jury weighed these arguments, but concluded that the deliberate nature of the act and evidence of premeditation outweighed youth. On June 18, 2008, Paris Bennett was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison, the maximum allowable term for a juvenile tried as an adult in Texas. In the years following, Paris has remained incarcerated, with occasional appeals upheld on procedural grounds but no reduction in sentence. Kim Bennett publicly expressed ongoing grief and trauma, noting the profound effect on her family and sense of security. Psychologists have cited the case as an example of extreme juvenile violence motivated by emotional manipulation. The tragedy also raised questions about early intervention for at-risk youth, juveniles' comprehension of consequences, and how family stressors can catalyze lethal behavior. As the Bennett case concluded, attention turned to broader implications of juvenile crime. The following case examines a different form of familial homicide, where hidden resentment and long-standing tensions erupted in fatal violence, offering insight into patterns and warning signs that can precede such tragedies. Bart Whitaker. On May 10, 2003, in Sugar Land, Texas, Thomas Bartlett Whitaker, known to friends as Bart, orchestrated the murder of his mother, Susan Whitaker, and his younger brother, Kevin Whitaker. His father, Kent Whitaker, was critically injured, but survived the attack. Susan was 49, a devoted mother and community volunteer. Kevin, just 16, was a high school student with a talent for music and a quiet, easygoing nature. Susan was known among friends for her warmth, while Kevin enjoyed a close bond with his father. Kent Whitaker, 51, was a successful businessman and active in local charities, respected for his calm and supportive demeanor. Bart Whitaker grew up in a middle-class suburban household. As an adult, he lived with his family in their Sugar Land home while attending college and working part-time. His relationships within the household were reportedly strained, and friends noted a sense of entitlement and growing frustration over his financial dependence on his parents. Bart had accrued substantial gambling debts and had expressed dissatisfaction with his family's control over money and life decisions. By 2003, this tension escalated into planning that would culminate in the deadliest day of his life. The trigger for the crime appears to have been both financial and personal. Bart, according to later court testimony, believed that eliminating his mother and brother would result in an inheritance that could solve his financial difficulties. He approached a family acquaintance, Chris Brassiere, to carry out the murders, offering payment for the act. The confrontation between Bart and Brassiere, as revealed in court, involved negotiation over timing, method, and compensation. Bart reportedly emphasized precision, stating that the plan had to be executed without leaving room for error. On the evening of May 10th, Brassiere entered the Whitaker home armed with a pistol. Susan Whitaker was shot multiple times in the living room. Kevin Whitaker, caught in the hallway, was also shot and killed. Kent Whitaker, confronted by the intruder, was shot but survived despite severe injuries. The attack lasted only minutes, but the rapid sequence of gunfire left a scene of immediate devastation. Brassiere fled, leaving Kent gravely wounded but alive, and the initial appearance of a home invasion obscured the true orchestrator. In the days following the murders, Bart Whitaker maintained a composed public presence. He visited his father in the hospital, expressing concern and grief. He reportedly helped coordinate funeral arrangements for Susan and Kevin, behavior that contrasted starkly with his role in planning the killings. Investigators, however, noted inconsistencies in his accounts and observed unusual financial activity. Forensic examination of cell phone records, email communications, and bank transactions revealed a pattern of planning and communication between Bart and Brassiere. Witness testimony and Brassiere's eventual confession linked Bart directly to the solicitation of murder. The trial began in 2004. Bart Whitaker was charged with capital murder. The prosecution presented evidence of premeditation, solicitation, and financial motive, emphasizing the meticulous planning and the targeting of his immediate family. The defense argued against the death penalty, citing Bart's youth and alleged influence over Brassiere, portraying him as less culpable than the hired shooter. In December 2004, a Texas jury found Bart Whitaker guilty. He was sentenced to death in 2005. For over a decade, Whitaker remained on death row, during which time his father, Kent, publicly forgave him, advocating against execution. This extraordinary act of forgiveness drew national attention. In 2018, after years of appeals and a petition from Kent Whitaker, the state of Texas commuted Bart Whitaker's death sentence to life in prison without parole. The decision reflected both legal and human dimensions of the case, acknowledging the complexities of family dynamics, remorse, and rehabilitation. Today, Bart Whitaker remains incarcerated, serving life without parole. Kent Whitaker continues to speak publicly about forgiveness, while the memory of Susan and Kevin Whitaker endures through the surviving family and community members. The case has prompted discussions about the influence of familial pressure, financial motivations, and the psychology of solicitation in violent crimes. The patterns of domestic crime often repeat, and the following case would once again challenge the notion of safety within the family home. Nehemiah Griego, January 19, 2013, in South Valley, New Mexico. 15-year-old Nehemiah Griego fatally shot 5 members of his own family inside their home, using 2 rifles from his parents' collection. Nehemiah's victims were his parents, Greg and Sarah Griego, and his 3 younger siblings, 9-year-old Zephaniah, 5-year-old Jael, and 2-year-old Angelina. Each was killed by gunshot wounds within the residence. The sequence and circumstances were later reconstructed through physical evidence and witness statements. Greg and Sarah were active in community and religious life. Greg, 51, had served as a pastor and volunteer chaplain with local fire and detention services. Zephaniah, Jael, and Angelina were beloved by family and familiar faces at church and neighborhood gatherings. Their deaths sent shockwaves across their community. Nehemiah lived with his family in their rural home outside Albuquerque. At 15, he was a high school student, described by relatives as active in church music and community functions. Authorities noted he had no significant criminal history prior to the shootings. In the days before the murders, those close to Nehemiah said he had shown signs of frustration and distress. In interviews after his arrest, he acknowledged homicidal and suicidal thoughts, particularly directed at his mother, and reported difficulty regulating his emotions. Shortly after midnight, Nehemiah took a .22 caliber rifle from his parents' closet and entered his mother's bedroom while she slept. Using that rifle, he shot her, then shot Zephaniah, who was beside her. He then went to the bedroom, where his 2 younger sisters slept. Jael and Angelina were each fatally shot once. Nehemiah then waited for his father. Greg Griego, returning from an overnight shift, was ambushed by his son with a .223 caliber AR-15 style rifle and shot multiple times. After the killings, Nehemiah loaded the family van with rifles and ammunition. Investigators later determined he intended to continue his rampage, possibly targeting strangers and intending to die in a confrontation with law enforcement. But that plan was never carried out. Instead, he drove to a church the family frequented and spent the day there. He spoke with his 12-year-old girlfriend, sending her a photo of his dead mother, then told church staff initially that his family had died in a car accident. A security guard, sensing something was wrong, brought Nehemiah back to the family home, where the bodies were in plain view. Police arrived and took him into custody without incident. Forensic evidence, ballistic trajectories, spent casings, and victim wound patterns confirmed the timeline. Digital evidence, including text messages to his girlfriend and accounts from church staff, helped establish his actions between the shootings and his arrest. Nehemiah was initially charged in juvenile and adult proceedings with 2 counts of murder for his parents and 3 counts of child abuse, resulting in death for his siblings. The case's complexity, centering on his mental state and age, led to extended legal wrangling. In October 2015, Nehemiah entered guilty pleas to second-degree murder and child abuse, resulting in death. His legal team argued for treatment within the juvenile system, citing mental health concerns, while prosecutors sought adult sentencing due to severity and premeditation. A court initially ordered juvenile sentencing, but that ruling was overturned on appeal. In 2019, a judge determined Nehemiah was not amenable to juvenile rehabilitation and should be sentenced as an adult. The sentence, upheld by the New Mexico Supreme Court in 2022, imposed 3 concurrent life terms with parole eligibility after 30 years, alongside additional fixed sentences for second-degree murder counts. He will serve his time in the adult prison system. For the surviving relatives, the loss has been profound. Extended family members have spoken publicly of their struggle to reconcile public scrutiny with private grief. Legally, the case highlights debates about how juvenile offenders should be treated in extreme cases, especially with premeditation and future danger. Psychologically, it prompted examination of early warning signs and the intersection of adolescent mental health with access to firearms. As the shadow of this tragedy lingers, the details of that January night continue to inform discussions about prevention, rehabilitation, and justice. Transitioning now to another case, we examine a very different set of circumstances that nonetheless grapples with questions of motive and accountability. Brian Britton. On March 22, 1989, in Poughkeepsie, New York, 16-year-old Brian Britton carried out a shocking attack on his own family. Armed with a 20-gauge shotgun, he shot 3 members of his household and critically wounded a 4th. His victims were his father, Dennis Britton, his mother, Marlene Britton, and his younger brother, Jason Britton. His older sister, Sherry Schaefer, was shot but survived. Dennis, 44, was employed locally and known as a steady provider. Marlene, 42, was actively involved in community activities. Jason, 8, was a typical grade school child, and Sherry, 18, was preparing to finish high school. The family was well regarded in their suburban neighborhood, and the attack sent shockwaves through the community. Brian was a sophomore at Arlington High School, living under his parents' roof. Friends described him as withdrawn in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Investigators noted his bedroom walls were plastered with action movie posters, including Rambo, revealing a fascination with military imagery. Tensions in the household reportedly included disputes over school attendance and personal conduct, though Brian had no documented history of prior violence. In the early hours of March 22nd, Brian retrieved the shotgun and began a deliberate sequence of shootings. Dennis was shot at close range in the bedroom. Marlene was struck in the living room. Jason was shot and also struck with the firearm's butt, sustaining fatal injuries. Sherry was shot twice, once in the abdomen and once in the head, collapsing in critical condition. The entire sequence occurred within minutes, with no signs of outside intrusion. Immediately after the shootings, Brian ran to the neighboring home of an uncle, claiming that an unknown assailant had attacked his family. The uncle called police, who arrived within minutes and found the 3 deceased family members and Sherry in critical condition. Brian was taken into custody at the scene. His claim of a masked intruder was quickly dismissed as investigators observed inconsistencies in his account. Forensic evidence confirmed that a single firearm was used in the shootings. Ballistics matched the shotgun taken from the Britton household. Sherry's survival and testimony were crucial in unraveling Brian's actions. Treated at a local hospital, she later confirmed that her brother was the shooter. Police records and local press accounts corroborated the sequence of events, culminating in a full confession from Brian, who admitted to shooting each family member himself. In January 1990, Brian pleaded guilty to 3 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. Prosecutors and defense attorneys negotiated a plea agreement, avoiding a lengthy trial, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison with parole eligibility after the minimum term. Under state law, Parole consideration began once the minimum term was served. For decades, his eligibility for parole became a recurring legal and emotional issue. Beginning in 2013, he appeared repeatedly before the New York State Board of Parole. Prosecutors, including the Dutchess County District Attorney, consistently opposed release, citing concerns that Brian remained a danger and had not shown genuine remorse. Social media posts attributed to him in later years, including statements to his surviving sister, reinforced those concerns. Sherry Schaefer, the sole surviving victim, became a vocal opponent of his release. She organized petitions and submitted statements to parole boards, expressing fear for her safety and that of her family. The parole process became a cyclical pattern. Hearings held, decisions to deny, and reevaluations every 2 years. Records indicate that Britton was denied parole multiple times throughout the 2000s and into the 2020s. After serving 33 years, the parole board granted Britton release in March 2023. He became eligible for supervised release following institutional preparation programs. The board considered his conduct, disciplinary record, and risk evaluations, though prosecutors and victims' advocates maintained serious concerns. Britton's case continues to prompt debate over juvenile offenders, rehabilitation, and public safety. The trauma for surviving family members remains profound. Sherry Schaefer's advocacy highlights the lasting psychological impact of that morning in Poughkeepsie. The case sits at the intersection of discussions on parole eligibility for juvenile offenders convicted of severe crimes, weighing decades of incarceration against societal reintegration. As the story of Brian Britton moves forward beyond prison walls, broader questions of justice, accountability, and healing remain unresolved for those who lived through that tragic morning. Seth Pravacki. On November 28, 1998, in Saginaw, Michigan, 17-year-old Seth Pravacki shot and killed 5 members of his family inside their home. The victims were his parents, James and Mary Pravacki, his grandfather, Edward Pravacki, his older brother, Michael Pravacki, and Michael's girlfriend, Christina Neos. The killings occurred the day after Thanksgiving and were carried out with a rifle kept inside the residence. James Pravacki was a working mechanic and the primary authority figure in the household. Mary Pravacki worked part-time in retail and managed daily family life. Edward Pravacki was elderly and lived in the home due to declining health. Michael Pravacki, 21, was employed locally and still living with his parents. Christina Neos was a frequent visitor and had been staying at the house during the holiday. All 5 were killed inside the home they shared. S. Fletcher Pravacki lived with his parents and extended family and attended a local high school. He was described as quiet, withdrawn, and socially isolated. He had few close friends and spent long periods alone in his room. While there was no documented history of violence, family members later acknowledged recurring arguments between Seth and his father, particularly over discipline, expectations, and Seth's future. The household was structured and tightly controlled. James Pravacki was described as strict, and disagreements between father and son had intensified in the months before the killings. Seth reportedly felt criticized and constrained. There were no reports of substance abuse, criminal history, or prior threats of violence, but emotional tension within the home was ongoing. On the afternoon of November 28th, a verbal argument erupted between Seth and his father. The dispute centered on responsibilities and behavior. The argument escalated but remained non-physical. After the confrontation, Seth left the immediate area of the house. Within minutes, he returned holding a .22 caliber rifle. The shootings occurred in sequence. James Pravacki was shot first, followed by Mary Pravacki. Seth then moved through the house and shot his grandfather, Edward Pravacki. Michael Pravacki and Christina Neos were shot last. The entire event took place over several minutes. Investigators found no evidence of resistance or defensive injuries, indicating the victims were taken by surprise. Autopsy reports documented multiple gunshot wounds for each victim. The wounds were consistent with close-range firing and deliberate aim. The pattern of injuries supported a controlled, methodical sequence, rather than a spontaneous or chaotic act. None of the victims were armed. After the killings, Seth remained at the house. He made limited attempts to conceal his actions, including repositioning items and accessing a computer. He contacted at least one acquaintance and provided misleading information. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots, prompting police response. Officers arrived later that day and discovered the bodies inside the home. Seth was taken into custody without resistance. During questioning, he initially denied responsibility, but later confessed. His statements were calm and detailed, outlining the sequence of shootings without claims of accident or self-defense. The investigation relied on ballistic testing, gunshot residue analysis, and scene reconstruction. The rifle, recovered from the home, was conclusively matched to the bullets and shell casings found at the scene. Seth's confession aligned with forensic findings and witness reports. Seth Pravacki was charged as an adult with 5 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution argued premeditation, citing his retrieval of the weapon and the ordered nature of the killings. The defense emphasized his age but did not dispute the facts. In 1999, he was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison without parole. While incarcerated, Seth was involved in disciplinary incidents but remained largely compliant. On June 30, 2010, during an attempted escape from a prison work detail, he was shot and killed by corrections officers. He was 29 years old. The Pravacki murders left a lasting trauma for surviving relatives and the community. The case continues to be examined in discussions of adolescent violence, family annihilation, and the escalation of domestic conflict. As this case closed, attention shifted to other family-based crimes, where internal pressures quietly built until violence became irreversible. Jeremy Bamber. August 6, 1985. Essex, England. On that summer morning, 5 members of the Bamber family were found dead at White House Farm. Among the victims were Sheila Bamber, 47, a devoted mother and wife; Neville Bamber, 55, her husband and a successful farmer; their adopted daughter, June Bamber, 25, and her twin sons, Nicholas and Daniel, both 13. All had been shot in what investigators would later describe as a coordinated attack, executed with a high-velocity rifle. Sheila's son, Jeremy Bamber, 24 at the time, would soon emerge at the center of the investigation. Jeremy Bamber had grown up on the family farm, one of several children raised in a rural community. Known among neighbors for his outgoing personality and occasional rebelliousness, he lived independently in a nearby farmhouse. Friends recalled a man struggling with both interpersonal conflict and financial pressure. At the time, he was reportedly facing mounting debt, tensions with his father over farm management, and a growing rift with his sister June regarding her children. While he presented a composed exterior, underlying disputes and personal challenges would later factor into the tragic events at White House Farm. On the morning of August 6th, an argument reportedly erupted between Jeremy and his father. The confrontation, according to later testimony, involved financial disagreements and accusations concerning the family business. Over the course of hours, the argument escalated. Evidence would indicate that Jeremy left the property briefly before returning with a rifle, a weapon kept in his residence. The sequence that followed was deliberate. Neville Bamber was shot while outside, Sheila inside the farmhouse, followed by June and her twin sons. Each wound, investigators determined, was precise, indicating controlled movements rather than panic or indiscriminate firing. After the shootings, Jeremy Bamber attempted to construct a narrative that would direct suspicion elsewhere. He reported that June, the adopted daughter, had committed the murders before taking her own life. Early police reports suggested that Jeremy appeared calm, cooperative, and concerned for the surviving family members, behavior that contrasted starkly with the brutality of the killings. Investigators noted his composure and the rapidity with which he contacted authorities, a detail that would later factor into forensic and psychological analysis. The investigation relied heavily on forensic evidence, witness testimony, and digital records of the time, including phone calls and travel logs. Ballistics test linked the rifle to Jeremy Bamber, while timing inconsistencies in his account of the day undermined the story he presented to authorities. The sequence of events, combined with corroborating evidence, led investigators to conclude that the murders were premeditated, motivated by personal disputes and potential financial gain. Over the course of the inquiry, the police meticulously reconstructed the morning of August 6th, piecing together movements, trajectories, and interactions that pointed squarely to Jeremy. The trial, held in 1986, centered on the question of intent and opportunity. Jeremy Bamber faced 5 counts of murder. The prosecution presented evidence of financial tension, witness accounts of prior conflicts, and forensic links between the weapon and the deaths. The defense argued that June Bamber had acted impulsively, citing her mental state and prior history, and suggested Jeremy's involvement was circumstantial. The jury ultimately rejected these claims. On July 28, 1986, Jeremy Bamber was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life imprisonment, with a whole life order, effectively ensuring he would never be released. In the years since, appeals and reviews have reaffirmed the conviction. Jeremy Bamber remains incarcerated, while the surviving extended family continues to navigate the loss and the enduring public attention surrounding the case. White House Farm has become a point of study for criminal psychologists, law enforcement, and those seeking to understand the dynamics of familial violence, premeditation, and the forensic reconstruction of complex crime scenes. The repercussions extended beyond legal outcomes. Friends, neighbors, and the local community grappled with the realization that multiple generations of a single family could be destroyed in a matter of hours. As investigators closed the chapter on White House Farm, questions of human behavior, trust, and the fragility of family bonds lingered in public discourse. Though each tragedy is unique, the next case would reflect a similarly chilling descent into deadly behavior. Lyle and Eric Menendez. On the evening of August 20th, 1989, in the affluent enclave of Beverly Hills, California, Jose Menendez, aged 48, and Kitty Menendez, aged 47, were found dead in their mansion. Both had been shot multiple times with a shotgun in what would later be described as a coordinated attack. Jose Menendez was a successful entertainment executive, and Kitty, a devoted mother, had maintained a prominent social presence in the community. Together, they were the parents of Lyle, 21, and Eric Menendez, 18. Friends and neighbors recall Jose as meticulous and driven, and Kitty as warm and attentive, though often private about family matters. The perpetrators were their own sons, Lyle and Eric, who had grown up in the shadow of wealth and status, yet under a complex family dynamic marked by tension and secrecy. Both young men had attended prestigious schools, but each carried emotional burdens, and by 1989, signs of psychological strain and interpersonal conflict were apparent. Lyle had recently left home for college, while Eric remained at the family residence. The confrontation that would culminate in violence reportedly followed a series of personal conflicts. Over time, the brothers described mounting fear and anger stemming from years of abuse, which they claimed had been both emotional and sexual in nature. On the night of August 20th, they armed themselves with shotguns and approached their parents' bedroom. The act was deliberate and sustained, with both brothers participating in the shooting sequence. Jose and Kitty Menendez were killed quickly, with forensic evidence later confirming the path and trajectory of the pellets, as well as the sequence of shots fired. Following the murders, the brothers did not immediately flee. Instead, they remained in the house, engaging in behavior that initially suggested normalcy. Friends and acquaintances reported that they were composed and cooperative with authorities upon arrival, which contrasted sharply with the violence that had taken place inside the mansion. The investigation relied heavily on forensic evidence, including ballistic analysis and the reconstruction of the crime scene, as well as testimony from family, friends, and neighbors. Authorities noted the absence of forced entry, the positioning of the victims, and the controlled nature of the shootings. Over time, digital records and interviews provided insight into the brothers' premeditation and the psychological state of both the victims and offenders. In 1993, Lyle and Eric Menendez were formally charged with first-degree murder. The trial drew national attention, both for the severity of the crime and for the claims of long-term abuse presented by the defense. The prosecution argued that the murders were motivated by greed, emphasizing the luxury and inheritance at stake. The defense maintained that years of abuse had culminated in a moment of fear and perceived self-preservation. Over a series of months, witnesses, psychologists, and forensic experts presented evidence that painted a detailed picture of family life and the night of the killings. On March 19, 1996, the jury delivered a verdict of first-degree murder for both Lyle and Eric Menendez. They were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a decision that reflected the premeditated nature of the act and its devastating impact. Appeals would follow, largely focused on procedural questions and the presentation of abuse testimony, but the convictions were upheld. For the surviving extended family, the murders left a profound and enduring scar. Friends describe ongoing difficulty reconciling the Menendez name with the violence that occurred in their Beverly Hills home. Psychologists and legal scholars have since examined the case to understand the complex interplay between familial abuse, mental health, and criminal responsibility. The Menendez case remains a reference point in discussions of parricide, highlighting the challenges of discerning motive, context, and culpability when violence occurs within the family unit.